Hello, everyone. Greetings. My name is Sean O'Donnell, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. On behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you to the Roosevelt Poetry Reading and Discussion with our featured poet, Camille Dungy. Camille Dungy is a poet, editor, memoirist, and professor who's had a prolific career in the field of eco-poetics. She's the author of 4 collections of poetry, most recently Trophic Cascade and the essay collection Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood and History. Dungy has also has edited several anthologies, including Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, and From the Fishouse, an anthology of poems that sing, rhyme, resound, syncopate, alliterate, and just plain sound great. As a poet and scholar, Dungy has championed African American nature poetry and helped situate it in the larger canon of nature poets. Through her own work, Dungy complicates the simple distinctions between what is natural and what is human, and she reminds us that the experience of nature is not often universal, but deeply shaped by language, experience, culture, and history. We're also fortunate today to have with us Major Jackson as our moderator. Major Jackson is a force of nature in his own right. Jackson is the author of 5 books of poetry and the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. He serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. I am pleased to say that he was our featured speaker for the Roosevelt Poetry Reading in 2017, and it's great to have him back. And he was a Radcliffe Fellow in 2007. Before I turn the program over to Camille, I just want to provide you all with a brief overview of the format for today's program. Camille will read from her poetry, and afterwards we'll engage in a discussion with Major about her work. After their discussion, we'll take audience questions. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short so that we can answer as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Camille Dungy.
Hello. Thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity to share time with all of you. I'm excited to get to talk about some poems. I thought that I would start with an awareness of some of what's happening in the larger world around us. And so I'm going to open today's reading with the first poem in a collection called Smith Blue. After opening the New York Times, I wonder how to write a poem about love. To love like God can love, sometimes. Before the kettle boils to a whistle, quiet. Quiet that is lost on me, waiting as I am for an alarm. The sort of things I notice, the bay over redbud blossoms. Mountains over magnolia blooms. There is always something starting somewhere. And I have lost ambition to look into the details. Shame fits comfortably as my best skirt. And what can I do but walk around in that habit? Turn the page. Turn another page. This was meant to be about love. Now there is nothing left but this. And this next poem I wrote almost 20 years ago now, which is quite a thing to consider. And I wished after I wrote it that the essential information conveyed in it might be retired. But as it turns out, not quite yet. Daisy Cutter. pause here at the flower stand. Mums and gladiolas, purple carnations, dark as my heart. We are engaged in a war, and I want to drag home any distractions I can carry. Tonight, children will wake to bouquets of fire that will take their breath away. Still, I think of my life. The way you hold me, sometimes you could choke me. There is no way to protect myself except by some brilliant defense. I want the black iris with their sabered blooms. I want the flamethrowers, the peony, the sunflowers. I will cut down the beautiful ones and let their nectared sweetness bleed into the careless air. This is not the world I'd hoped it could be. It is horrible the way we carry on. Last night, you cataloged our arsenal. You taught me devastation is a goal we announce in a celebration of shrapnel. Our bombs shower in anticipation of their marks. You said this is to assure damage will be widely distributed. What gruesome genius invents our brutal hearts? When you touch me, I am a stalk of green panic and desire. Wait here while I decide which of these sprigs of blossoming heartbreak I can afford to bring into my home. Tonight, dreams will erupt in chaotic buds of flame. This is the world we have arranged. It is horrible. This way we carry on. I just feel like one of the things about poetry is that it provides the space sometimes where we can escape into beauty and wonder and joy. But because to write poetry well is to use language honestly, and to really fully be in touch with the breadth of human experience and emotion, it also means that poetry is this place to hold trauma and terror and anxiety, and that sort of interesting space where both things can be true at once, that we can acknowledge beauty and see beauty and celebrate beauty while also acknowledging and being very clear about horror and what else might be happening in the world. As I've been thinking about the Ukraine, for some reason, what keeps coming to me, I told Major this, I think actually just yesterday, I just keep thinking, there must have been children who were excited for their birthday parties over the weekend. And then the world changed. And the world changes for all of us all the time. But for some reason, thinking about that kind of hope being just demolished in such a way, that's just what's been sticking with me over the last few days. So I thought I would read you a poem in which a birthday party does show up, but not necessarily all the things that we might expect. Notes on what is always with us. This week, I threw a birthday party for my mother, and grief came along with the cake. 10 mothers at my mother's birthday dinner, 3 of them bereaved of a child. The dead celebrated right there with the living. We asked grief to be quiet But she smiled, smacked her lips, and tore into her steak. On land, adult penguins have no natural predators. The big bad wolf is not in Antarctica a problem. No lions, no tigers, no bears. Penguin eggs and penguin chicks are always at the mercy of skua and disaster, but even from the leopard, seal, and orca, the land-hauled adult penguin is safe. I am trying to write about penguins, about predatorless terrains. I am trying to write about joy and a kind of cold beauty, but grief won't stay away. Grief will ride in on the smallest of bodies, a tick on a cormorant's wing. If the winter isn't cold enough to kill it, that tick will embed itself in a penguin's neck, the back of her head, anywhere the penguin cannot reach. And because she has no way to tell anyone, and because even if she could convey her agony, there would be no way for her fellow birds to help, she will itch for a while, swell for a while, then abandon her nest for the water's relief. She will run and slide and dive into danger. Her eggs will die and her chicks will die, and she may die as well. I am trying to write about predatorless terrains, but grief will ride in on the smallest of bodies, a tick on a cormorant's wing. I try to write everything down because I know it would be easier to forget, and I want to avoid the comforts of suppression. Scouring journals for my notes about seabird ticks and their toll on Antarctic penguin populations, I find a different set of notes. I'd written, the only time I really talked to you was in your Trenton kitchen. What I meant was that was the only time I ever saw you genuinely smile. The baby needed food, and you, just back from pushing his stroller on a long walk during which you and he both watched the morning sun shine on the faded splendor of those Trenton streets, were boiling a hot dog for your only son and smiling. There are things I do not want to say, I said in my journal, except the not saying won't return anything you love. The boy is dead. The boy's mother is dead. I was trying to write about beauty, but grief won't stay away. I was trying to write about babies and birthdays and birds. I was trying to write about joy. So I feel like that's one of the things when I write about the greater than human world, there's always for me this kind of intermixing between these kind of large ideas about ecologies and landscapes and systems, and then these kind of smaller connections that I end up making and that I can't avoid. And I don't know if that's the case for you who are here with me today. Maybe it's a quirk of the way my mind works, but I don't think so. I think that for many of us, for most of us even, there's this possibility for a kind of permeability between the world that is beyond us and the world that is of us and inside us. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things about poetry, about writing, is figuring out how to access that connection. Trophic Cascade. After the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone, and as anticipated, their culling of deer, trees grew beyond the deer stunt of the mid-century. In their upreach, songbirds nested, who scattered seed for underbrush. And in that cover, warrened snowshoe hare. Weasel and water shrew returned, also vole. And came soon hawk and falcon, bald eagle, kestrel, and with them hawk shadow, falcon shadow. Eagle shade and kestrel shade haunted newly buried runnels where mule deer no longer rummaged, cautious as they were now of being surprised by wolves. Berries brought bear, while undergrowth and willows, growing now right down to the river, brought beavers who dam. Muskrats came to the dams and tadpoles came to the night song of the fathers of tadpoles. With water striders, the dark gray American dipper bobbed in fresh pools of the river, and fish stayed. And the bear who fished also culled deer fawns, and to their kill scraps came vulture and coyote, long gone in the region until now. And their scattered seed, and more trees, brush, and berries grew up along the river that had run straight and so flooded, but thus dammed, compelled to meander, is less prone to overrun. Don't you tell me this is not the same as my story. All this life, born from one hungry animal, the whole new landscape, the course of the river changed. I know this. I reintroduced myself to myself, this time a mother, after which nothing was ever the same. So that's the title poem for my collection, Trophic Cascade. When I came across that poem, the content of that poem, and finished it, I realized that that idea of the Trophic Cascade, which is an ecological term for when a major trophy creature is introduced or removed from a landscape, all the cascading changes that occurred as a result. And the book was centered so much about how my life had changed with the arrival of my daughter, but also how my life was affected by the loss of elders. And so the introduction and removal of my personal trophy creatures. And within this kind of often a very ecologically informed construct. And so it seemed like it was the title that the book needed. Though here's the first poem in the collection, and another title I toyed with making the title for the whole book. Natural history. The rufous hummingbird builds her nest of moss and spider webs and lichen. I held one once, smaller than my palm, but sturdy. I would have told Mrs. Jeffers from Court Street, if in those days of constant flights between California and Virginia, I'd wandered into that Oakland museum. Any chance I could, I'd leave my rented house in Lynchburg. I hated the feeling of stuckness that old city's humidity implied. You need to stop running away so much, Mrs. Jeffers would say, when my visits were over and I leaned down to hug her. Why, her words come to me, the woman dead for the better part of this new century, while I think of that nest of web and lichen, I cannot rightly say. She had once known my mother's parents, the whole lot of them, even then in their 20s, must already have been as old as God. They were Black. The kind name for them in those days would have been Negroes, and the daily elections called for between their safety and their sanity must have torn even the strongest of them down. Mr. Jeffers had been a laborer, the sort I regret I don't remember. He sat on their front porch all day near his oxygen tank, waving occasionally to passing Buicks and Fords, praising the black walnut that shaded their yard. She would leave the porch sometimes to prepare their meals. I still have her yeast roll recipe, the best I've ever tried. Mostly, though, the same Virginian breeze that encouraged Thomas Jefferson's tomatoes passed warmly through their porch eaves while we listened to the swing chains, and no one talked or moved too much at all. Little had changed in that house since 1952. I guess it's no surprise they come to mind when I think of that cup of spider webs and moss made softer by the feathers of some long gone bird. She used to say, I like it right here where I am, in my little house, here with him. I thought her small-minded. In the winter, I didn't visit very often. Their house was closed up and overheated. Everything smelled of chemical mothballs. She had plastic wrappers on the sofas and chairs. Everyone must have once held someone as old and small and precious as this. I feel like Mrs. Jeffers might get a kick out of the fact that the book I'm working on right now is a book called Soil, which is focused on my staying put and thinking about this yard where I live now. I thought I would give you just a little sneak peek of the first page of this new book. I sat in my realtor's Lexus while she toured me around Fort Collins in the waning weeks of May 2013. At that time of year, flurries from cottonwood fill the Colorado sky. Fluff gathers in yards and the road's margins like snowdrifts. Apple trees, mountain ash, hawthorn, chokecherries, all their white petals fall into sidewalks, pile on the windshields. This disoriented me. I thought by May, Colorado should be heading into summer, but all that whiteness made it seem as if winter might be coming down. Neighborhood by neighborhood, petal-strewn grassy margins whiz by the windows. My shoulder-length locks and the realtor's brunette waves swayed in and out of each of our side views. We never got out of the vehicle. I didn't want to look closely at anything yet. Ray and I would come back later that summer and choose a house to buy. On this trip, I just wanted a lay of the land. Aside from the trees shaking off their petals, it was too early for most flowers. All that whiteness swirled around us, and I wondered what I was getting my family into. As we drove, the American plains spread behind us. Jagged granite peaks of the Rocky Mountains loomed ahead. I wanted a home where our family could stretch out in peace. The town's steady growth meant we'd be able to afford our own house with a yard, leaving behind the rented apartment that stretched our budget in Oakland. But I had to figure out what was going on with all that white mess around me. Was I going to suffer teary eyes and headaches thanks to all the shedding cottonwoods? Were those fallen ash petals going to be a hassle to clean up? And what about the people in this predominantly white town? Would they welcome our family? My mind worked as it wondered. I looked to understand this place's disposition based on the evidence of a history of interactions with the living world. Cottonwood fluff can travel on the wind for up to 5 miles, carrying with it seed looking to grow a new tree. As May unfolds into June here, the ash's white petals will finish, the hawthorn's petals, the chokecherry buds, and the apple blossoms too. Trees will go green, leafed out for a new year. Gorgeous in their own way, what fruit comes in will welcome birds who'll take berries for themselves and also to feed their young. Birds who set up nests sometimes, or sometimes just settle for a moment's rest. I'm saying that there is promise all over when I look, but sometimes I have to stay in one place long enough to see it. At our tour's end that late spring day, the realtor asked me, "Where do you think you want to live?" I've been wondering that ever since. I'm going to read just a couple more poems. This first poem was written in around June 2020, when this nation was coming to a kind of collective reckoning that some of us knew was a long time coming and seemed to also come as a surprise to others. In her mostly white town, an hour from Rocky Mountain National Park, a Black poet considers centuries of protests against racialized violence. 2 miles into the sky, the snow builds a mountain unto itself. Some drifts can be 30 feet high. Picture a house, then bury it. Plows come from both ends of the road, foot by foot, month by month. This year, they didn't meet in the middle until mid-June. Maybe I'm not expressing this well. Every year, snow erases the highest road. We must start near the bottom and plow toward each other again. This next poem starts with an epigraph from BBC Nature News. A fifth of animals without backbones could be at risk of extinction, say scientists. Characteristics of life. Ask me if I speak for the snail, and I will tell you. I speak for the snail. I speak of underneathedness and the welcome of mosses, of life that springs up, little lies that pull back and wait for a moment. I speak for the damselfly, water skeet, mollusk, the caterpillar, the beetle, the spider, the ant. I speak from the time before spinelessness was frowned upon. Ask me if I speak for the moon jelly. I will tell you one thing today and another tomorrow, and I will be as consistent as anything alive on this earth. I move as the currents move, with the breezes. What part of your nature drives you? You in your cubicle ought to understand me. I filter and filter and filter all day. Ask me if I speak for the nautilus, and I will be silent as the nautilus shell on a shelf. I can be beautiful and useless. If that's all you know, to ask of me. Ask me what I know of longing, and I will speak of meadows of night blooming. I will speak of distances between meadows of night blooming flowers. I will speak the impossible hope of the firefly. You, with a candle burning and only one chair at your table, must understand such wordless desire. To say it is mindless is missing the point. All right, I'm closing with one final poem for my very first book, What to Eat, What to Drink, What to Leave for Poison. And I want to read this poem here with this Harvard Radcliffe community, because I wrote this poem while I lived on the Cambridge Somerville line, just a block away from the Wine and Cheese Cask, which I looked up today and was pleased to see is still in business. And so I thought I just wanted to close with a poem that was inspired from walking the same streets where I'm being hosted today. What you want. There is a kind of woman whose switch comes from the willow of her hair, and whose sway is unnerving, and who branches what she knows, and whom far beyond your knowing. A kind of woman miraculous as the flight of many heavy birds. You crane to see her formation shifting always in and again in to a darting perfection that knows where heat lives. Her kettle is ever brewing, and inside you will find bits of yourself, skin and muscle and force of will, slipping off the bone, tender and delicious. Thank you.
Camille, fantastic reading, Camille. I always found your work capacious, instigative, transparent, deep in the possibilities of how we might see and inhabit the world we live. So I'm very delighted, first of all, to talk to you, because you and I have been talking for a long time, and lately we've been wanting to get together and find, some of the areas that bring us to the page, but also kind of explore. And this gives me another opportunity to kind of explore. One of the things I've marveled over the years is, and this has to do with your education as a poet, both like formal and informal. But I'm thinking about your apprenticeship to language, and I'm thinking about your deliberate attention to what I consider an evolving consciousness that awakens us through your writing, your memoirs, your poems, to the complexity of living at this hour. And that is constitutive of our dreams and the fulfillment of those dreams, but also the demolishing of hope, the shock of losses. In your poem that you read, Notes on What Is Always With Us, you say, I want to avoid the comforts of suppression. And you say in another poem, we must climb toward each other again. How have you arrived at these purposes for your writing? What conversations do you figure in large part undergird your vision?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Major. It's always a pleasure to walk this path with you, and then to get to talk in these ways. So thank you for your just consistent care and attention, and I think often very similar interests, and then also sometimes challenging interests, right? That there's also things that we've brought to this relationship over the years of pushing each other to see things differently than might be the easiest way of understanding and seeing the world. And that's the thing to me that's so important. I mean, we are all so busy. There are so many things we could be doing with our time. All of you watching now could be doing myriad other things with this hour. And so if you give me the grace of your time and your attention, I want to give you something. I want to earn that trust and that time. And so I have to give new ways of seeing, or new ways of attending to the world. I want to give honesty, and often honesty requires the opposite of laziness, right? It requires us to dig down and ask the real questions, not the surface questions. We're very frequently settle for the easy question, which will give the easy answer. But if the easy answers were sufficient, we wouldn't be in the messes we are now. In so many different ways. And so one of the things that poetry can offer, that literature can offer, are new questions that might provide new answers. And then for me, as I really think about expanding ideas of what environmental writing might look like, as I think about expanding ideas about what African-American writing might look like, what women from women could look like, right? All these kinds of identities that are inside me as I work to expand the limitations that centuries of thought have set on those worlds and minds. I want those to also provide invitations, right? For us as writers and also as readers, for just new ways of experiencing and caring about and for the world around us.
That is a great lead into what I'm seeing in some of the questions. As you know, we are at the beginning of another potentially global, impactful, a kind of geopolitical crisis right now that in a lot of ways, as we know, implicates language, either as propaganda or illuminating as to this terrorizing spiritual journey we find ourselves as a species. The invitation is fascinating to me. One of the questions is among the viewers is, do you feel pressure to kind of speak to this moment as a writer, given our particular relationships to language?
As is often the case for me, my answer to this is yes and no. I'm a very yes and kind of person in the world, which I think is also really important, because there just can't be one answer. And anytime we're striving for just one answer, we limit, the possibilities of productive surprise. So yes, there are so many things happening in the world: the ecological crisis, this European conflict, and the ways that we are all directly implicated in it, because so much of it really has to do with energy, right? Energy and water, which are two again really interconnected realities. And so I don't want to be silent, right? Like if I feel pressure, it's an issue of like not wanting to be silent in the face of crisis that needs attention, right? Of all of us, but particularly the artists who are providing new ways of seeing and new ways of understanding. So that feels in some ways like a pressure, yes. And also, there is nothing new that started on Thursday. Nothing new started on Thursday, right? Like everything that we live every day is predicated by yesterday and the yesterdays before. So if we pay attention to history, the future should never surprise us, right? And so in that way, I don't feel any different pressure than I felt on Wednesday because I have always been attended to history and understanding the way that our historical interactions with the environment, with energy, with resources, with each other will continually drive us to the brink of disaster unless we pay attention, right? To the mistakes we've made in the past and to the positive changes and roads that we've taken, right? So in that way, I don't feel any different pressure today than I ever have felt as a writer, because I know that whatever happens tomorrow depends on what I do today. But I also know that I have a grounding in a reality that's larger than me. And so I can be disappointed and I can be scared, but I don't really have cause to be surprised.
I hear that. There's a passage in your, just thinking about history, thinking about its weight on our pens, our consciousness. There's a passage in your brilliant anthology where you say the recognition of the connectivity with worlds beyond the human is revealed as a necessity of spiritual and physical survival. Talk to me about poetry as survival for you. You and I have talked in the past about your advocacy with this anthology and now as poetry editor of Orion magazine, through your poems, so rich in natural spaces. I so have appreciated how you've called our attention to the soil underneath our feet. Talk to me about that as survival, but maybe as just the thing that animates who you are today, much in the same way that becoming a mother shifted for you, and is now. I can, I see you as, no offense, but I see you as poet, but I also see you as Kylie's mom. So
she will appreciate that, and that is in fact a very, very important part.
But they're intertwined, is what
of
I'm
who
saying.
I am. They are
Right.
intertwined. They are absolutely intertwined. Yeah, I mean, in Black nature, 4 centuries of African American nature poetry, I like, part of my thing was like, 4 centuries, right? Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first Black person to publish a book in the English language, right? Like that's a thing to think about. Out of Boston, right? And she has a line in one of her poems on imagination, is the poem. She has a line that says, "These northern climes forbid me to aspire." And she's talking about the weather because it's, Boston. But she's also talking about the weather, right? She's talking about the culture around her of institutionalized racism and enslavement and debasement and kidnapping of children to serve in the household of white people, right? Like that's a climate that forbids one to aspire as well. So that blending of talking about the weather and then like not being able to ignore the fact that that is directly tied up, right? With culture, with politics, with the lives that people are allowed to live. So this new book I'm working on, its title is Soil the history of a Black mother's garden. And as I started to like dig into the soil with my daughter and thinking about, oh, here are these plants and these are the things they're doing. And we're trying to restore a native, indigenous, a native flora and fauna in this suburban tract home development that we have, for all kinds of reasons, for my daughter's future, because honestly, it's really much easier to have native Western plants growing out here than try and bring exotic cultivars that just like wilt in the heat and then it gets too cold at weird times. And so it's just easier to have native plants that just seem to shrug off Colorado's weird climate. But then what? Why aren't these here? Like, what's the kind of like the history of excluding these native plants from the space? Who are the people whose names are attached to all of these plants and these birds and the animals? And what do those names and those histories and records of who gets held up and who doesn't? What do they reveal about who my daughter and I have been allowed to be in this country, who other brown people on the same space have allowed to be, and the ways that we are or not allowed to thrive in this land. And so all of a sudden there I am, I'm just like trying to write about a flower. I'm just trying to write about a flower. And like, it just gets like, it gets bigger very, very quickly, which is sometimes exhausting. But usually just really invigorating to me as I dig down deeper and deeper into the soil that we grew up out of.
So there's several questions in the chat, one by a fantastic poet who asked several questions, asked this in a way: what has to be in place for you as a writer when you sit down and write your poems and your prose, your illuminating prose? Someone even asked about pre-writing habits. Let's give them some secrets.
What goes in to my writing,
what
my
has
work?
To be in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just turns back to this word that I've used several times in this hour, which is attention. Mm-hmm. I think there's so much of our culture that pushes against attention. We just don't have time. We don't have the energy, and we don't stop and really look. But I make myself stop and look. I've had times when I felt particularly busy and overwhelmed where I really will set a timer. And that timer will go off at regular intervals during the day, and I am to stop for a minute, whatever it is that I'm doing, and just pay attention, which can be really funny if I'm in a faculty meeting or something like that. Like what kinds of things do I notice there? If I'm out for a walk, then I'm paying attention to the kinds of things that are expected for a poet to pay attention to, but that's not really how most of us live our lives most of the time anymore. And so how can we train that attention in all of the parts of our lives? And then when I do that, those kinds of interconnections start to reveal themselves more and more frequently in different kinds of ways. So that's it. I think that's my key secret sauce, is just trained attention.
Is there, someone asked in the chat, is there favorite writers that you have encountered over the years that help you to pay attention?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my two go-tos for this are in many ways aesthetically opposites, and that's important too, to understand that this kind of attention isn't about aesthetics. It's not about how long your lines are or how long your poems are. We will each do with this kind of trained attention something different. The two poets are Bob Hass and Lucille Clifton. So Clifton writes these taut, tight poems. I never use the word little and I never use the word small when talking about Clifton's poems, but sometimes they are as short as 10, 12 lines. So they're very taut poems, in which she just hones in on whatever really deeply metaphysical connections, usually between the lived world and the living world, and the kind of consciousness, that this collective consciousness that she's able to tap into. Bob Hass does the same thing, but in these expansive poems that sometimes can take 5 pages sometimes, and just long lines often, and just this kind of long breath. It's a very different way of manifesting a similar kind of, I really see as a kind of spiritual connection to the world, people, and the greater than human world, both that show up in their work. And they don't shy away from the political, and they don't shy away from the historical, and they don't shy away from the personal, even as they will talk about a fox or a marsh, or these other things that seem to be very outside the human.
There's a question about revision. What's your revision process? I was curious about Trophic Cascade because, as you know, it's one of my favorite poems of yours, and I teach it because of its structural integrity, how that cascading, how the poem fulfills that sense of cascading, and then there's that gorgeous imperative: don't tell me this isn't what I experienced as a mother. Tell me about, maybe walk me through that poem and how it came to be.
I mean, the revision process usually is like, there's the attention, that I take notes, and I was obsessed with that Trophic Cascade story. And so I did all this research. Research is part of my revision process, really. It's part of both my drafting and the revision process, because I have to get things right. I remember at some point in Trophic Cascade, I talked about the mothers of tadpoles, because I was like, aligning myself with ridiculous gender norms that just aren't true, as it has to do with the tadpole in particular, because it's not the tadpole's mother that sings, it's the male it's the male frogs, right? So those kinds of revisions are also about fact, right? You gotta, like, you again, if I'm gonna earn your trust, you have to actually believe what it is that I'm saying. So there has to be that kind of factual revision, and then once I kind of had all that in place, I was writing, and I was so interested in this list, but then I was like, but why? And that's the next question in my revision process, is like, why does this matter? Why do I care, and why is anyone else going to care? And that's where that "don't you tell me this is not the same as my story" came in. So that's very late in the process. I was just obsessed with the Trophic Cascade, and then I was like, but this is not a poem, it's simply a list. And so what makes this matter as a poem? And so that came in. And then formatting, like the structure on the page, sometimes comes later, sometimes comes during. This one is right justified, so it's flipped to the opposite margin of how a poem would normally be, and that was the last change that happened. I had it, I finished it, it was fine, it sounded fine, but it didn't look fine. It didn't look like a revolution, and the poem was about a revolution, and I was like, oh, pop, and I just like hit that little button at the top of my word processing program and flipped the justification, and then the landscape changed inside the poem. And so very often, like, how are my line breaks? How are my stanzas broken? What's the shape of the poem on the page? Because we experience the world visually. And so the visual component of the poem is deeply important to me. And that's another one of the steps of revision for my work.
I think we might be coming close, but I want to get this one in because I'm curious too. Someone asked about voice and how is it linked to who you are, both as writer, but also as mother in the world, as professor? Does it change? Can form itself be a kind of voice?
Mhm. Form itself can absolutely be a kind of voice. All of my voice has shifted and changed throughout my writing career, as I would hope. You know, I always tell my students, like they're always like, I want to find my voice. I'm like, you can find a voice, but like you probably aren't going to want the same voice when you're 40 that you had when you were 20. So like, be open to change and shifts and nuances. So in my early work, I wrote a lot of persona poetry because I liked the idea of sliding in to the voices and lives of other people and learning what I could learn from other lives. And then as I have my own experiences differently, like it remains important that how I sound on the page is pretty close to how I would sound if you met me, like a little bit stylized and a little bit tightened up, but I want my poems to sound intimate, as if I'm speaking to you and with you. And so that has been, to me, one of the most important things about refining my voice over time. It's like maintaining a sense of intimacy and honesty, circling back to the very beginning, intimacy and honesty about how I convey my experience of the world.
Camille, thank you. Thank you so much for both the reading and this discussion. And you give us so much. I'm so delighted that folks will, if they haven't been introduced to you before, but your work has meant so much to me as a fellow poet and friend. So happy to join you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these great questions.
Thank you, everyone. And that was really a gift, especially during these times. This concludes our program for today. I want to say thank you, Camille, for sharing your work, and Major for your skillful moderating. I also want to thank you, our audience, for your terrific questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information on upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see videos of past events, please visit www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and please take care.